There are nights that change everything. Nights so quiet on the surface that no one thinks to ask questions until it's too late. Nancy Guthrie had one of those nights, and the people who lived closest to her, the ones who could see directly into her world, they didn't just witness something that evening. They witnessed everything, every shadow, every movement, every moment that should have told someone that something was deeply, terribly wrong. But here's what makes this story different from the ones you've heard before. The neighbors didn't stay silent because they didn't care. They stayed silent because someone made sure they would. Someone with enough power, enough reach, and enough coldness to look ordinary people in the eye and tell them, without blinking, that speaking up would cost them more than they were willing to pay. So what exactly did they see? What happened inside that house on that darkest of nights? And why, for so long, did the truth stay buried beneath fear, whispers, and carefully chosen silence? Nancy Guthrie's story is not just about one woman. It's about what happens when a community knows the truth and still can't speak it. It's about the weight of secrets carried by people who never asked to carry them. And it's about what finally happens when silence breaks, not with a whisper, but with a sound loud enough to shake everything. Stay with me, because this story deserves to be told in full. Nancy Guthrie was, by every account, the kind of person who made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. She had that rare quality, a laugh that arrived before she did, a way of remembering small details about people that made them feel genuinely seen. She remembered birthdays. She brought food when neighbors were sick. She was the person who showed up, not because it was convenient, but because she believed that showing up was simply what good people did. She grew up in a modest home in a part of the country where community still meant something, where front porches were used, where people knew each other's names, their children's names, their dogs' names. She carried that upbringing with her into adulthood like a lantern, letting it guide her choices, her relationships, the way she moved through the world. By her late 30s, Nancy had built a life that looked, from the outside, like something worth envying. A home with a real yard, a job she was proud of, friendships that had survived years and distance, and the ordinary wear of life. She was someone who had worked for everything she had and never once made others feel small for having less. But behind the warm light she cast on everyone around her, there were corners of Nancy's life that stayed dark. There were things she didn't talk about at the dinner table, pressures she absorbed quietly so that no one else had to feel them. A relationship that had begun with genuine tenderness, but had, over time, begun to shift in ways she couldn't fully name at first, and by the time she could name them, she wasn't sure who would believe her. That's the part people miss about stories like Nancy's. The darkness doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't announce itself. It creeps in slowly, disguised as misunderstandings, then stress, then something harder to define. And because it's gradual, because it mirrors the texture of ordinary life, it becomes almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. Her neighbors, the families on either side, the couple directly across the street, they noticed things before Nancy ever said a word. Small things at first, a changed energy, a careful walk, the way she sometimes paused at her car door before getting in, like she was deciding whether to leave or stay. They noticed, but noticing, they would soon discover, was not the same as being able to act. Nancy Guthrie was a real person living a real life, and what happened to her in the months that followed would test not just her own strength, but the conscience of everyone who lived close enough to see. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came not with a scream or a confrontation, but with a silence so complete it was almost physical. It was a Tuesday evening. The kind of unremarkable Tuesday that you'd forget within a week if nothing unusual happened. But something unusual did happen. Nancy's neighbor, a retired school teacher named Margaret, noticed that Nancy's kitchen light, a warm amber glow that was usually visible every evening, as Nancy cooked, was off, not dimmed, not flickering, off, and the house behind it was completely still. Margaret told herself it was nothing. Maybe Nancy had gone out for dinner. Maybe she was tired and went to bed early. People were allowed to change their routines. But something in her gut wouldn't let the thought settle. Because it wasn't just the light. It was the car still sitting in the driveway. It was the fact that she hadn't seen Nancy step outside all day. It was the accumulation of small absences that, each on their own, meant nothing, but stacked together, formed a shape Margaret didn't want to name. She thought about knocking on the door. She genuinely considered it, standing at her own window for several long minutes, watching the dark house across the way. But something stopped her. Not indifference. Something more complicated than that. A feeling, not yet fully formed, that the situation might be more dangerous than a wellness check. That if she knocked, she might not be knocking on just a door. She wasn't wrong to feel that way. She just didn't know yet exactly how right she was. On the other side of Nancy's home lived a younger couple, David and Priya, who had moved into the neighborhood 2 years prior. They were private people by nature, but not cold ones. They'd shared meals with Nancy, borrowed her ladder, had the kind of easy friendship that grows between people who share a fence line. They knew her habits. They knew her rhythms. And that evening, David noticed something that made him set down his coffee and stand very still. He heard voices through the shared wall. Not conversation, something sharper. He couldn't make out words, but the cadence was unmistakable. The rise and fall of someone trying to keep a confrontation contained. The specific, controlled tone of someone who wanted to shout but had, for whatever reason, chosen not to. And then, silence. The kind that follows something final. David looked at Priya. Priya looked at David. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then David said, quietly, "Should we call someone?" And Priya said, just as quietly, "Who do we call when we're not sure what we heard?" That question, who do we call when we're not sure, is one that would haunt both of them for a long time afterward. Because the answer, it turned out, was more complicated than either of them could have imagined that night. And what would happen next would make sure they stayed quiet, whether they wanted to or not. What the neighbors didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the person inside that house with Nancy was someone who had spent years learning exactly how much he could get away with. His name doesn't matter here. What matters is the pattern. What matters is that he understood, with chilling clarity, how to use fear as architecture. How to build walls around a situation so carefully that even people standing right outside couldn't see clearly what was happening within. He was charming in public, genuinely, convincingly charming. He remembered names. He told good stories. He shook hands with the kind of firm warmth that made people trust him immediately. In the neighborhood, he was known as Nancy's partner with an easy familiarity, like he'd always been there. No one had a bad word to say about him, because he'd made absolutely certain of it. But inside that house, he was something else entirely. Nancy had learned this slowly, the way you learn the depth of water only after you've waded in too far to turn back easily. By the time she understood the full shape of who she was living with, she had already been systematically cut off from the people and support systems that might have helped her leave. Her confidence had been quietly dismantled. Her sense of her own perceptions had been challenged so consistently that she had started to question whether what she saw, felt, and experienced was even real. This is what people outside the situation rarely understand. It's not just fear that keeps someone in place. It's the careful, deliberate erosion of the self. And Nancy had been eroded, piece by piece, without ever seeing the full scope of what was being taken from her. After that Tuesday night, something changed in the neighborhood. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gathering on the street, no whispered counsel. It was subtler than that, a collective, unspoken awareness that had begun to harden into something more concrete. People were paying attention now in a way they hadn't before, watching, waiting, trying to make sense of the pieces. Margaret had started keeping a kind of informal record, not written down, nothing that formal, but mental notes. When she saw Nancy's car move, when she didn't see Nancy at all, whether the lights came on at their usual times. She told herself she was just being a good neighbor, but she was also, without fully naming it, building a case, assembling evidence against a feeling she didn't yet know how to report. And then he found out she was watching, not through anything dramatic, through the simple, quiet calculus of a man who had spent years controlling his environment. He noticed Margaret's attention, the glances, the pauses, the way she lingered just a moment too long at her window. And he did what men like him do when they sense their carefully constructed walls are being observed. He came to her door, politely, pleasantly, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and he said, with perfect neighborly calm, that he hoped everything. The threat didn't need to be explicit to be effective. That was the most insidious part. He never said anything that could be reported, nothing that could be quoted in a police statement or presented as evidence of wrongdoing. He was far too careful for that. What he delivered instead were implications, soft, almost friendly implications wrapped in ordinary conversation. A comment to David about how neighborhoods could get complicated when people made assumptions. A brief, pleasant exchange with Priya about how important it was to mind one's own business in close quarters living. Small remarks, casual, the kind you might replay later and wonder if you'd imagine the menace in them. But they hadn't imagined it. None of them had. And the effect was precisely what he'd intended. The neighbors pulled back, not because they didn't care about Nancy, they did, deeply and helplessly, but because they'd been made to understand without a single explicit word. That caring had a cost. That speaking up, calling someone, asking questions, might bring consequences they weren't prepared for. He had made himself into something large and vague and dangerous in their minds, a threat without a specific shape, which is somehow more frightening than one you can clearly see. A name, Nancy, meanwhile, was navigating her own version of this terror every single day. She had tried, once, to reach out to someone outside the house. A phone call, kept short and careful, to a friend who lived 2 hours away. She had said just enough to plant a seed, just enough to let someone know that things weren't right. But the call had been noticed, and the conversation that followed, the one inside that dark house, had been the worst she'd experienced up to that point. After that, she stopped trying to reach out. For a time, she believed she was completely alone, but she wasn't alone. Even though she couldn't see it from inside that house, something was shifting. The neighbors, despite their fear, hadn't fully disengaged. Margaret, 3 weeks into her deliberate ignorance, had a moment of quiet reckoning while washing dishes one evening. She thought about a student she'd taught years ago, a quiet girl who used to come to school with long sleeves in summer. She thought about how many times she'd noticed and not known what to do, how many times she'd told herself it probably wasn't her place. She thought about how that story had ended, and she put down the dish in her hand and picked up her phone. She didn't call the police directly. Not yet. She called a local domestic violence resource line instead, a number she found after 15 minutes of careful, private searching. She spoke to someone for a long time. She described what she'd seen, what she'd sensed, what had been said to her at the door. She asked what she could do without making things worse. The person on the other end of the line listened with the kind of attention that felt, to Margaret, like being genuinely heard for the first time in weeks. That she was told what to document. She was told what to look for. She was told, gently but clearly, that what she'd experienced at the door of that visit, those soft implications, was a recognized tactic, a form of witness intimidation that happened more often than most people knew. And she was told that she wasn't imagining any of it, that her instincts had been right all along. Margaret began to document everything the very next day. What followed was not a single dramatic moment, but a slow accumulation of courage from multiple directions at once. Margaret documenting David and Priya quietly comparing notes with her one afternoon when he wasn't home. A third neighbor, a man named Carl who'd lived on the street for over 2 decades, admitting that he'd seen things over the past months that had troubled him deeply, but that he hadn't known were part of a larger pattern. They were careful. They had to be. They understood that moving too quickly, making the wrong call at the wrong moment, could put Nancy in greater danger rather than less. The resource line Margaret had contacted connected her with an advocate who helped coordinate with local authorities in a way that kept the situation as controlled as possible. This was not a process that moved in straight lines. There were setbacks. There were moments of doubt. There were nights when Margaret sat at her kitchen table and wondered if what she was doing was the right thing, or if she was only going to make everything worse. But Nancy, though she didn't know about any of this yet, was also moving, quietly, carefully. She had found a window, literal and figurative, in the daily pattern of that household, a small span of time, predictable and reliable, when she was alone and unmonitored, She used that time to do something she hadn't done in months. She started writing things down. A private, hidden record of what was happening to her. Dates, incidents, details that she knew, even through the fog of isolation, might matter one day. She didn't know when. She didn't know how. But something in her, the part that had survived all of it, the part that hadn't been fully eroded, told her to be ready. The night everything broke open was, like most pivotal moments in real life, not the night anyone had planned for. It arrived without announcement, carried on the back of an ordinary evening. But ordinary evenings, it turns out, can reach a tipping point just as easily as dramatic ones. Something escalated inside that house to a level that crossed the line between private terror and undeniable emergency. A sound that could not be misinterpreted. A moment that left no room for the careful ambiguity that had protected him for so long. And this time, David didn't pause. He didn't ask Priya who to call. He called, and he stayed on the line, and he gave the address clearly and without hesitation. When it was over, when the lights of official vehicles had washed across the street, and the neighborhood had come quietly to its windows, Nancy emerged from that house for the first time in what felt, to those watching, like a very long time. She looked different, not broken. That's the word people use, and it's the wrong one. She looked like someone who had been carrying something impossibly heavy and had just, for the first time, been allowed to set it down. Margaret was outside. Nancy saw her, and something passed between them, a recognition that needed no words. That Nancy had not been as invisible as she'd been made to believe. That people had been watching, not with indifference, but with the complicated, imperfect, genuine care of people trying to do the right thing inside a situation that had been deliberately designed to make that impossible. The recovery that followed was not fast or clean or simple. It never is. But it was real, and it was hers. Nancy Guthrie's story is not a comfortable one. It's not the kind you walk away from feeling easy or resolved, but it is the kind that matters. Because somewhere, right now, there is someone in a situation like Nancy's. Someone whose neighbors are noticing things and not quite knowing what to do with what they see. Someone who is keeping their own private record, holding onto the quiet hope that one day it will matter. And there is someone like Margaret, standing at a window, feeling the pull between fear and conscience, wondering whether it's their place to act. It is. It always is. You don't have to be certain. You don't have to have all the evidence. You don't have to know exactly what is happening behind someone else's wall. You only have to be willing to make one call, to trust the instinct that says something is wrong, to refuse to let the fear of being wrong keep you from doing the one thing. That might make everything different. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone, or something you've noticed and set aside, let that feeling mean something. Share this. Talk about it. And remember that silence, even well-intentioned silence, can be the thing that costs someone everything. Nancy found her way through. Not alone. Never fully alone. And that is precisely the point.